Hi, this is Nahid, and welcome to our boundary series. This is video number 2, and if you're watching them in order, then you will have been working on your boundaries trigger log and will have brought it to this video because we'll be teaching you what your responses in the trigger log mean. If you have not done the trigger log, either because you didn't get around to it or because you're watching these videos out of order, let me show you what it is. So what we did in our first class was ask people to spend some time filling out what we call a boundaries trigger log. I'm not going to get into the details, but there are some instructions here on the screen, and if you'd like to take a quick screenshot, you can, or you can go back and watch boundaries video 1. Today, what we're going to do is go over what you can learn from your entries. So notice that we have situation, feelings, reactive thoughts, what I did, and what happened. And for those of you that are just coming into this, one thing you can do right now, just so that you can participate fully, is pause the video and write 3 or 4 or even 5 examples of times you were recently triggered in relationships. And that should give you enough information. Make sure to include the situation, feelings, reactive thoughts, what you did, and what happened. Now let's talk about what you can learn from these entries. So in the situation column, you're really just setting the stage, what happened, what's going on, but we're going to actually use this column for an exercise later in the class. The thoughts, feelings, and what I did columns are really important because they help you separate sort of what I was thinking, what my emotions were, and how I actually behaved. Separating those out into 3 distinct pieces of self-observation will really allow you to understand more deeply what's going on. And then that final column, the what happened column, is very useful because if you start logging several entries, so we said that your goal was 10, but let's say you decide that you want to log 20 entries and you start noticing patterns. One of the things that you're going to get in those last 2 columns, which is what did I do and what happened, you'll get some immediate useful information on how you behave and how other people respond to your behavior. Now, you would think that this is obvious, but often we don't really pay attention to our patterns of behavior and how others respond differently based on how we behave. And so if you said, well, I talked to the person, or I was frustrated and I talked to the person versus I was calm and I talked to the person, and you may notice that the person responds differently to you based on the time that you had that frustrated tone of voice or that intense energy or that fear versus when you were really calm and you talked to them. So those 2 columns are there just for you to get some insights and to really start developing some self-awareness around patterns that you may have that you have not been paying attention to, automatic ways that you have been interacting with people and ways that they respond to you. And just that insight in itself can be powerful. Let's talk about the thoughts and feelings columns. So the thoughts and feelings columns are really important because the feelings column is going to start telling you when your boundaries are being crossed. Typically, when boundaries are crossed, you're going to feel it before you think it. And so a lot of times when I ask people, what were your feelings? What were your thoughts? People use thinking words to describe their feelings. So this table in itself is going to be very helpful in having you think about, well, what is a feeling word? What was I actually feeling in my body? Was I feeling angry? Was I feeling annoyed? Was I feeling frustrated? Was I feeling enraged? Those are all different flavors of anger, and they can make a big, big difference. Resentment has its own unique quality to it. So describing those feelings are really important because they help you get more and more awareness into what your unique feelings pattern is when your boundaries are crossed. And what'll happen is you can begin to recognize that feeling coming up sometimes when you're not even realizing that your boundaries are being crossed. Actually, one of the things that we talked about quite extensively in class is how often you don't know that you have boundaries until they have been crossed, because we don't know that we need to be protected from behavior until we start noticing that the behavior is causing harm. So we often don't go into relationships proactively setting boundaries. We often go into relationships in good faith, and the dynamics of the relationships begin to drain us, annoy us, upset us in some way, or just start feeling weird. And that weirdness that we're feeling is what helps us define what the boundaries are that are being crossed. So that's why the feelings column is so important. And your thoughts column is important because we all make up stories that explain what's going on. And in your thoughts column, you may see things like, that person is such a jerk. They're such an a-hole. They don't respect me. They're not treating me right. You want to capture those words so that you can see what happens in your head, how you tend to explain those moments. They're interpretations, they're not necessarily the truth, and they're things that can fuel your own emotions and get you out of the place you need to be in order to effectively set a boundary. So if you're caught up in how somebody doesn't respect you, coming to the conversation with them in that mode of they don't respect me usually is not going to get you results. So it gives you something to reality test, but you need to know what your automatic stories are. We all have them, so don't feel bad about having them, but try to capture them accurately. And in fact, the most immature thoughts that you have are the important ones to get down. I have people, I ask them, what were your immediate thoughts? And of course, they have the childish thoughts fly through their head, but they know those are childish thoughts and they know that they're not the truth. So they immediately tell me the mature thoughts that come right after those childish thoughts. But where you're going to get your most insight is from those first childish thoughts. So capture those. You don't have to show anybody your log, but knowing those thoughts that fly through your head, that's going to give you a lot of leverage. Now, the situation column, that column is going to be really important for what we do next. If you're like most people, what you wrote in the situation column probably has a lot to do with the character of the person that was annoying you or upsetting you in some way. So they're being a jerk or something like that. What we need to do is really now identify what are the boundary crossing behaviors for you. And the way we do this is with this other worksheet. You can take a picture of this if you like. Boundary situation, behaviors I don't like, and what I would prefer instead. So I'm going to give you some examples here. I'm going to give you 3 examples. One is that my spouse was impatient and being a jerk. Notice that the word impatient is a characteristic, or it's a state of being. My spouse was being impatient and being a jerk. Those are words that characterize how the spouse was being, what your interpretation was of the behavior. It does not explain what the behavior was. If you said my spouse was impatient and being a jerk to me, I would have no idea what behaviors your spouse was engaging in. So what you want to do is take what you have in your situation column and now pull out what were the exact behaviors. So in this case, what my spouse was actually doing that made me believe that he was impatient and being a jerk is because he was complaining with a very critical tone of voice about things I hadn't done. Now that makes it very clear. And then what I'd like you to do is add a 3rd column, what I would prefer instead. I would prefer that he talk to me about what he'd like or need, but not in that tone and with appreciation instead of scorn. Another example, my son is being a slob. Again, people can kind of infer what you mean by that, but it's better to get specific. So he left his things around our main living areas. He left plates, he left shoes and clothes, backpacks. So what would I prefer now? I would prefer that he take dishes, use dishes, plates, glasses to the kitchen when he's done with them. And I would prefer that he take his clothes, shoes, backpacks up to his room. And so now we're getting very concrete and specific. And what this is going to set you up for are effective boundaries conversations. Let's take one more example. My mother was making me feel guilty. Well, what was she doing to make you feel guilty? We can all identify with someone making us feel guilty, but that again, that does not give us information on what they were actually doing. Giving unsolicited advice about how I should handle my kids. Yeah, we can all agree that that could make you feel guilty and a lot of other things too. What do I want her to do instead? I want her to assume I'm a good mom. I want her to listen to me. I want her to reassure me that the kids will be okay and only share experiences and advice if I ask. And when she does share them, I want her to share them as options, not dogma. So see how clear this is. So that is your next step. So what is the purpose of doing this exercise? What you want to do is begin to understand all of these pieces of information that you're gathering, and every column that's in your boundaries trigger log and in this new worksheet we're having you fill out will give you real information. First of all, the feelings column is getting you more tuned in to when your boundaries are being crossed, so you can get clarity on that. Your thoughts column is giving you more information into the stories that you automatically go into when you're explaining things that upset you. Your behavior, what I did, how I handled it, and how others responded to me, that's going to give you immediate information about the automatic behaviors that you go into when triggered and how others respond. And you're going to sometimes handle it one way and sometimes handle it another way. And as you start noticing the differences in how people respond to you based on how you behave, you're going to start immediately learning how you can be more effective in those situations. And then the situations column, that is now giving you your stage, setting the stage for the situations that upset you and allowing you to pick them apart and pull out the behavior patterns that are crossing your boundaries. When you pull out the behavior patterns that cross your boundaries, and then you say, what's a behavior that's causing me pain? Only then do you have the clarity you need to say, well, what is another behavior I would prefer? And the reason it's important to fill out that list is because the behaviors that you prefer will form the basis of the next activity we do in our next lesson, which is creating your boundaries rules. I am looking forward to seeing you then. Have fun with these exercises. If nothing else, you're going to get lots of insights and you may have some new experiences. See you soon.